All right, we're good.
Greetings, First Baptist family. We are here again with our series Abide With Me, the integration of faith and mental health. This week, our final week, we're going to be talking about relationships, which is really just a more concerted effort to pay particular attention to relationships, because obviously we have been talking about relationships this entire time. But this is the time where relationships themselves get the specific spotlight that they deserve. So I'm going to share some thoughts later on, but first we're going to start with Dr. Doyle Hamilton.
Good morning, or afternoon, I guess, whatever you might.
Or evening, could be any time when you're watching this.
Exactly. So, yes, what we've been talking about through the whole series is about relationships. And we talked a little bit about how depression, anxiety, abuse impacts the dynamics, the constellation within the family. And today we're going to kind of continue talking about relationships. And Amy and I were just talking this morning before we began recording about how important it is to take Jesus' command seriously about self-love and self-respect. And I love that passage that Jesus said that we need to and must love the other to the degree that we're able to offer love and care to ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so Amy was saying she had a little soapbox about that. I think I do too. And we get sideways mm-hmm. when we don't care and nurture and listen to ourselves. We get sideways. So you want to say a little bit about your thoughts, Amy, about that?
I do. Those commands, the greatest commands, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. We think of those as the two greatest commands, when in reality, they are the three greatest commands. Love God, love yourself, love neighbor. And yes, that is actually the order. God first, yourself, your neighbor. And the reason why is you've probably heard me say this before, and hopefully you will hear me say it a bunch more times before my time at First Baptist is up, and that is you will love your neighbor as you love yourself. It is a law, if you will, in the sense of gravity is a law. If I hold something up here and then I drop it, the law of gravity says it will go down, not up. And in the same way, love your neighbor as you love yourself is a law. How you love yourself is how you love your neighbor. And you may think that, oh, I treat my neighbor like better than I treat myself. You might be able to keep that up for a little bit of time if the conditions are right, but eventually, when push comes to shove, when things get tough and you're caught between a rock and a hard place, the same judgments that you hold against yourself are going to come out and be weaponized and enacted on the people in your life that you are trying to love. That's why I always tell people to be brutally kind to themselves. And the word brutal is key in that description, because we're so used to self-flagellating, mm-hmm. to beating ourselves to bloody pulps internally. And honestly, our culture praises that. Mm. Our Christian culture praises people who honestly are abusive towards themselves.
It's not healthy.
It's not healthy. And so when we challenge ourselves to actually be kind, it will feel wrong. And since we're trained to really find our self-worth in our worthlessness, like it's not me, it's God. That's the only good thing about me is God. Or I am just the worst. Or all of this, like, because we define our spiritual maturity often by how much we hate ourselves and how motivated we get by our self-hatred, when we start being kind to ourselves, it doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels threatening. Like, tell me if you've had this thought before. Oh, but if I don't hold that against myself, then I'll just slide down this slippery slope into backslidden debauchery. I have to be harsh with myself. That is not what God is asking you to do. He's asking you to love yourself so that you can love your neighbor in the same fashion. And so when people come back to me and they say, well, sure, you gotta love yourself, but like not too much. Like, don't love yourself too much. And I would say, that's not a thing. You can't love yourself too much. I'm gonna say that again. You cannot love yourself too much. What you are afraid of is not actually love. And you do have to go to the point of discomfort and feeling even threatened by love. Like, allowing ourselves to be, this is my soapbox, allowing ourselves to be loved is literally the most vulnerable thing we can experience in life. I would say the second thing is loving. But the most vulnerable thing we can experience is being loved. And a lot of, I think, the damage that we experience and that we perpetuate in relationships is resisting being loved, because it can be so hard. It hurts our pride. And when we have dealt with our fears in life by convincing ourselves that we are not worthy of love, then actually allowing ourselves to feel love feels very scary. That's where self-sabotaging comes into play. But back to you, Doyle.
Well, it just reminds me about how sometimes when let me just use an example. If I'm working with a couple and there's abuse going on, maybe verbal abuse, hopefully, any abuse is abuse. It's not good. But one of the things that can be redemptive and healing is if the person that is being abused can begin to be honest about what they're feeling. And oftentimes it's anger or rage. Mm-hmm. I will often say, well, thank God you feel that. And the reason I say that is that being respectful of your internal process, your thoughts and your feelings, could possibly help you put feet to a changed behavior.
Yeah.
So denying, well, I don't want to feel angry, or I don't, I shouldn't feel angry, or whatever. That's not healthy thinking. Anger is a God-given emotion.
Preach, Doyle. Yes. Amen.
So if your question is, what do you do with your God-given emotion? Right, Amy?
Right. Can I interject here?
Oh, please do, because I don't have anything else to say.
It's a team effort, this show. Yes, I'm so very grateful that you brought that up, because I will say, again, speaking of things that our Christianity tends to demonize, loving ourselves is one of them, which is really sad considering that God is love and how he feels about us. And the second thing that gets really demonized is anger. And I'll just throw this out there, specifically if you're a woman. A woman's anger is very, very demonized. Men are allowed to be angry more than women are allowed to be angry, but we all suffer under this, men and women alike. But I remember when I first started working with my beloved therapist, and I told her about something that had happened that year. And as I'm telling her, she stops me and says, well, were you mad? And I was like, well, no, like, I mean, this person was doing the best they could with what they had. And, you know, she didn't really know. And also she's been through a hard time. And Paula, my therapist, was like, Amy, I am mad listening to this. Like, you can be mad. And I'm like, oh no, like, I can't be mad. And then I heard myself say to her, it is not safe for me to be mad. And she goes, ooh, is it now?
Yeah.
And we then talked about how when I was a child, I would get angry and I would get so punished for being angry. And as I got older, that punishment turned into really just abandonment. And the worst thing that a human being can experience is abandonment. Therapists I've spoken to talking about studies of babies not being held have summed up the research as saying abandonment is deadly. It will literally kill you. That's how bad it is for you. And so with that in mind, experiencing abandonment because I was angry meant that I had to stop being angry because I couldn't survive being abandoned. And, you know, it's not like my parents were dropping me off in this dark alley where I was going to get, you know, killed. But a child doesn't know that. And a child's brain and body were all one, remember? So it does feel like that survival kicking in. It does feel that heightened. So anyway, back to experiencing anger. What my therapist said to me is, she said, Amy, in the Bible, God is angry way more often than mankind is angry. Like something like 3 times as often as angry as human beings are. So to keep in mind that anger itself is not sinful.
Yeah, that's why I love the Psalms so much, because the laments are about crying out to God and pouring your heart out. A great book that I have on my shelf in my office is a book by Andy Lester, and the title of the book is Coping with Your Anger, and the subtitle is A Christian Guide. And he helps normalize the God-given emotion of anger. But he has a little visual in the book that to me is really, really helpful. He has a circle that is the representative of the individual, and an arrow coming from the exterior toward the individual. And the question, he says, with anger is, what is the threat? So if you can identify what the threat is with the anger, you can, because some would say that anger is a secondary emotion.
Yeah.
So sometimes it can get funneled into depression or anxiety. A lot of times when I know for men, we might tend to be angry, and sometimes we'll get depressed as a way to give expression to our anger. So back to Lester, Andy Lester, he says the key is to ask yourself, what is the threat? If you can get clarity about that, you might find a different way to respond.
Yes, I love that you brought up both those things, because that's something I wanted to add that my therapist Paula said to me, because at the time that I engaged her services as a counselor, I was very, very, very depressed. And as I just began sharing about my life and she started pointing out the anger, she said, you know, appropriate anger turned inwards is depression. And that was, wow, a light bulb moment for me. And I do tend to agree with that idea that anger is a secondary emotion. I heard a preacher once say that anger is fake power, which didn't make sense to me for almost a year. until I started observing it in myself. And I realized, oh, I often like display anger towards other people
Mhm.
when I feel threatened, when I feel scared, when I feel powerless. My response to that is anger.
Right.
And so I do think that that question, what is being threatened, is a great way to kind of sort through the whirlwind energy that is anger. And to realize, like, yeah, we're most likely to feel angry in situations where we feel powerless. Unless, of course, like in my case, in certain relationships in my life, and it wasn't safe to be angry. So I had to swallow that anger, and it became depression for me.
Right. Like internalized energy is kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, Amy, did you come up with a text?
No.
No? Okay. We had talked about, because there's so many texts that we talked about and discussed about relationships and how to think about the fact that we are all relational, we're creatures of relationships.
Yeah.
And just to say it, this COVID-19 is just challenging so greatly my need to be around people, to touch, to pass the peace, to give a hug. I never realized how important the faith family relationships were to me until these last few weeks, when I hadn't been able to be around anybody. I don't know if other people have experienced that too, but it's just not the same when we worship corporately and there's nobody there. It's just different. So anyway, relationships that's just the way we're created.
Yeah. Well, and we think about God himself is a relationship. If we believe in the Trinity, the triune Godhead of Father, Son, and Spirit, and that they're all God, yet somehow distinct, yet somehow the same. As a side note, when I was in youth ministry, we were doing VBS, and I remember I've had so many students ask me about the nature of the Trinity, and so I ask them what they think, and then when they start floundering, I say, "Now you have it." Once you don't get it, that's the closest you're going to come to it.
The mystery of God, to me,
Yeah.
it's just the mystery about it.
So we cannot diagram the Trinity, and thank God, because I hate math. Thank God that God is undiagrammable. What a wonderful gift to me, Amy Hayes, personally. Thank you, Lord. But back to the nature of the Trinity. However it is that God is three and God is one, I can't explain that. But what we can say is that God himself exists as a relationship. And if we're made in the image of God, what does that tell us about us? Can we really even be fully human without relationships to other people?
Well, I love the Greek word for spirit is pneuma. And I love that word because we get the English word pneumonia from it. And the context is the very breath of God.
Yeah.
Think about that. The very breath of God is with us, even when we don't know it, don't see, or don't experience. The breath of God, the Spirit of God is with us. I find that profoundly comforting.
Yeah, absolutely. And to go back to, I think organically we discovered our text is love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself.
There you go.
So to kind of tie together that with, so our primary relationship is that one with God, and to go back to this idea of anger. something that really, really resonates with me is that idea that God can handle my anger, and that actually is like a part of our relationship. And I have really like heard for years, well, you can be mad at God. And I'm like, can you though? Or is it only like the appropriate kind of anger? Like, do you mean like the real anger?
Yeah.
Like the kind that would say, get you fired from a ministry job? Like that kind of anger? Like, can you be that angry? And I'm telling you, the answer is yes. Yes. If you were a part of our Enneagram class, then you know that I'm an 8, which is the challenger. And anger is our go-to emotion. Hence why I was so desperately depressed, because I was ingesting quite a lot of anger. And in the end of our Enneagram class, I did this exercise with everybody, which was, let's get in the presence of God and see, what is it that you need God to say? What do you need to hear from God to you about who you are in light of what you know about your type? And before we did it with the class, I came up with this exercise on my own. So I had my own time with God to process this. And I just sat there thinking, yeah, what is it that I do need to hear from God? Like, what would be really great? And I just started thinking about, what the Enneagram has shown me about who I am, and different parts of being an 8 that get held against me the most, which is being angry, being intimidating, being controlling. And every type has their negatives. So I was going through that and kind of thinking through the different messages that I've gotten from important relationships in my life, which is, you're really intimidating, you can be really scary. And I kind of just turned my attention towards God, and I thought, yeah, what would be the best thing to hear from God? And just all of a sudden it came to me, and it was God saying to me, as a beloved parent, I'm not afraid of you. And I was just like, oh, really?
Bring it on.
And I remember I just burst into tears at that thought. Like,
That's so loving.
yes, which was very surprising to me, because I thought, come on now, you've been in church your whole life, you're in seminary, like, you know better. You know God can handle your anger. But even so, like, when you hear it from God saying, like, I'm not scared of you. And it was just this.
Tell me more. I can hear God saying, tell me more.
Yes. And I'm like, ah! And God is like, tell me more. Oh, so wonderful, you guys.
Isn't that beautiful? Well, think about this. Think about, Amy and I were talking about this earlier about parenting, about how stress of the child can be opportunities for connection and relationship with your children. And
Yes.
I was referencing to Amy, John Gottman's book about emotional intelligence. And his belief is that the tendency for the parent, and I understand this as a dad, is that we want to take the child's stress away from them. But the hard work of parenting is to be present with the child in relationship and use the stress of the child's life as an opportunity for connection and relationship. And that's a mouthful, because sometimes it's hard to do. And sometimes as a dad or as a mom, you want to fix the boo-boo, right?
Yeah.
And the child's developmental challenge in relationship with others, with self, with the world, is learning how to deal with stress in his or her own way, in his or her own time. So it's a great book about how stress can be an opportunity for connection and intimacy.
Yeah, I love that. And as I shared in some previous session just about my sister and my niece, and watching her be a mother has been so wonderful. And my sister is an avowed and very happy atheist. And even so, watching her with her child, I just again turn my attention towards God, and I just feel so loved by you, watching them together. Yeah. And thinking, oh, this is how you are with us. It's so
It's a,
sweet.
it's a glimpse.
Yeah.
It's a glimpse.
It's really, really amazing. So just being surprised by the tenderness of God when we are not very tender ourselves, is so surprising. I'll never forget. This is maybe a little off topic, but it's so wonderful. I'm going to share it anyway. So my niece is 3, and when she was not yet a year old, I remember one time I was riding in the car with her and my sister, and I was sitting in the back seat with my niece Bonnie in her car seat, and we've been driving for a long time. And this poor babe just starts crying, and Auntie Amy cannot fix it, can't comfort her. And then it just turns into like wailing. My sister is in the front passenger seat, and so she's like, she turns around and tries to kind of like engage with Bonnie, but Bonnie is just not having it. And it's just so painful because and Rosemary is looking at me because I'm like, ah. And she's like, she just wants to get out of the car. Like, she wants me to hold her, but I can't. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is the worst, because like the reason Rosemary can't take her out of the car seat is because we're in the car, and that would be dangerous. And it's her love that is keeping her in this car seat. And so we're kind of racing home so we can get Bonnie out of her car seat. And I just thought, wow, this is just like God and me, where we're on some sort of journey, and it has gotten to the point where I'm like, I'm done now. I don't want to play this game anymore. I don't want to be patient or holy or whatever it is that you need me to be. My spiritual maturity has withered, which I'm guessing is an experience that some of us are feeling right now during the pandemic. This has gone on long enough. I'm tired. And we start doing whatever our adult version is of throwing a fit. And I used to think that God's response to that was like, well, when you have a better attitude, this will be over. Or I will come comfort you and meet your needs when you shape up and grow up. Which, if you've been paying close attention, you might think sounds suspiciously familiar to the fact that I had to swallow my anger in order to not be abandoned. Connections.
Yes.
But when I was in the car with my niece and with my sister and watching this happen, and I just realized, we got home, and Rosemary just bounds out of the car and just immediately gets Bonnie out of her seat and is comforting her. And I think, yeah, she was not going to punish Bonnie. Like, that's her child. The journey, how long the journey took is just how long it took. It had nothing to do with whether or not Bonnie cried. It was just how it was. And I think sometimes we get stuck in this trap of, if I had a better attitude, or if I was just more spiritually mature, then I could get out of this. And I would just gently challenge that and say, sometimes I think the journey just takes how long it takes. And God is not driving in the front seat being like, I'm going to slow this car down until you learn how to not cry. No. Unless you are like a little child, you will not enter the kingdom. It should be instructed to us, I think.
Which is open and vulnerable.
Yeah, open and vulnerable.
Longing for connection.
Yeah.
Wow, that's good, Amy.
Absolutely. So I love what you shared about, like, the stress of the child can be this impetus for connection, and we are meant to we are naturally biochemically drawn towards other people when we're going through stress. I watched this TED Talk one time that talked about how oxytocin, which is famously known as the cuddle hormone, because it's what happens when you hug someone for like longer than 45 seconds. Your body releases oxytocin. It's also what's released between a mother and baby when they're nursing. But in this TED Talk, it talked about how oxytocin is also a stress hormone, that it gets released when you're stressed because it makes you want to be around other people. And so to realize we need to approach our relationships like that when someone is having a hard time. And, you know, I think it's maybe more obvious when it's a child. But when we're adults, we kind of throw our fits in unexpected ways. I know for me, when I get upset, I'm just going to withdraw because I don't want to like show my anger at people. And so I need my loved ones to recognize that and say, hey, you seem to be withdrawing. Would you like to talk about it? Or do you want to be alone? And then I'll be like, well, I just am upset. And then I'll probably cry and then we'll bond.
Well said. Well, I am so thankful. Did you have anything else you wanted to say, Amy?
I had a few notes. Let me just double check them.
Okay.
Make sure I haven't forgotten anything. One other thing I wanted to bring up that I think is really practical in relationships is Saint Brene Brown, my favorite. She wrote about this in her second book, I believe, which is the Rough Draft. And that is, she did some research with some neurobiologists about brain chemistry. And what she found out is that human brains are hardwired for story. And story to a brain is very simple. It's just something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so when we construct stories in our brains reward us with the pleasure chemicals. So that's what it means. Literally, we are hardwired beyond our conscious brain to make stories. So this doesn't mean like necessarily fantastical stories or amazing movies that people come up with, although those things are also a function of this brain wiring. But in our everyday lives, we make up stories all the time. We call them assumptions. And so the example that she gives is, she says, you go into a conference room and you've been stressed about this presentation. You give this presentation and your boss just has like a scowl on her face the whole time you're talking. So you leave the meeting, you don't talk to her, things fester for days because you're like, the story you're telling yourself is she's mad that I did a bad job. And then you start making up corollary stories to that. It turns into a whole world of stories, all based on these facts. I was talking, she was scowling. Those are just two facts that happened in the same situation. So our brain takes those and it relates them in a story format. We had a bad conversation yesterday. I had the presentation. She was scowling because she's upset. So we just take these facts and we place them into a story. And as we know, assumptions get us in a lot of trouble because often they are not true. And something interesting that Brene Brown noted is that we are very much more likely to construct bad stories. Like we tend to always assume the worst.
Negative.
Instead of good stories, because we're also wired for survival. So if you think of it in terms of fight or flight, if you assume something is bad or wrong, you're on a subconscious level prepping your body to survive. Whereas if you assume something good, you're not prepping yourself to survive. So just know, like, this is not a character flaw. We're all hardwired this way to make stories out of disparate facts, and almost always they're going to be negative. And so what she suggests is just this really simple script that I use this all the time with my friends and family when I start to have emotions. And that is, I've constructed a story. So I will go to that person and say, the story I'm telling myself is that you don't want to spend time with me because you haven't texted me back. And then the other person can say, oh, no, I do. I lost my phone for the last 3 days, or I have been overwhelmed with finals. That's me. So that's fact checking the story in your head, which I know the obvious question then becomes, yeah, but what if your story is right? Well, then you get to have connection in conflict and actually resolve what's really going on. I had to do this just with a friend recently, a classmate of mine who is one of my very best friends, and he also happens to be extraordinarily competitive. And so I had told him some good news regarding me and school, and he had not celebrated with me, which hurt my feelings. So maybe a week later, he starts sharing about this, and he says, you know, I've just been feeling really insecure and feeling very inadequate. And when you told me that news, it just sent me into this spiral. And I was like, oh, yeah, no, I totally understand that. This happened to me, but with one of our other classmates, where his achievement sent me into a spiral. But then I was also able to say, like, you know, it did hurt my feelings when you didn't celebrate. And he said, I know, I'm really sorry.
Oh.
And so the story that I was telling myself, that he was jealous and withdrawing because he felt inadequate, was right. But it still led to connection. And it was probably even a week after this conversation, he comes back to me and just says, I'm just so thankful for our friendship and the conversation that we had. I just feel so secure with you that we could be that vulnerable. And I was like, yeah, I mean, we're all just trying to figure it out, honestly.
That's,
you know?
so good.
Yeah.
It reminds me of what's called the feedback loop. And it's a little tool that you can use to repair connection with people. And I think it's got 4 points. What I saw, what I made up, what I need, or what I would like. So you tell the other person what you saw in terms of the behavior, what I made up in my head. I made up that I'm not your friend, or I'm not important to you. What I need is, and then it invites you to have a conversation. I love what you're saying, because it invites a relationship and the conversation that brought amends and reconciliation to you and your friend. Yes,
exactly. And that's something that I know can be really hard for us, is to say what we need or what we prefer. But to challenge yourself to be brave and do that.
Exactly.
And I think brave is such an apt word for that, because it is scary. Brave acknowledges the fear. It doesn't dismiss it. Yeah. But it's an invitation to face it anyway, for your own sake. Like saying your needs, that's a way of loving yourself.
And with relationships, sometimes it's easy to talk about what we don't like, which invites the other to want to pull back. But when we can talk about what we need from the other, it invites the other to lean in and be attentive and responsive. So it's a way of inviting relationships and connection.
Yes. And again, like, if you can be brave and love yourself enough to make your needs and your requests known, because you have worked through like your own biases against having need, because yet again, that is something we unfortunately value and reward in our culture, is people who don't have needs. We celebrate them. Bad, wrong, no, don't do that. It's human to have needs.
That's the way we're created, right?
We were created with needs.
Absolutely.
Think about how that's such an insult to say that someone is needy. It's crazy. Now, you can not be able to handle someone else's needs. Like, just because someone comes to you and says, like, I need this, you can also say, I can give you this, but I can't give you that. And I mean, that is also an act of courage and an act of love, both for to yourself and to the other person. So, you know, I remember one time there was a national controversy going on with an organization I used to work with. So I had dozens of friends calling me and texting me to get my opinion on it, since I used to be employed by this organization. And about the time that the seventh friend texted me a news article and said, "Hey, what are your thoughts on this?" I said, "Hey, I actually have been inundated with requests for comments on this, and I just cannot engage with it anymore. I hope you understand." And she said, "Oh, of course, I'm sorry, I didn't know." And I was like, "Yeah, oh yeah, I know you didn't know. That's why I was letting you know. Just like, hey, I've reached my limit.
Maxed out.
I'm maxed out." And to also challenge yourself to not apologize for having needs.
Yeah.
That's, you know, we say sorry when we don't mean it all the time.
All the time.
And again, this is true of everyone, but it's really true of women. So I would challenge you, like in all of your relationships, to love yourself well by not apologizing when you don't need to. This is another really practical thing that I loved. I saw an infographic once on Facebook that said, don't say "I'm sorry" when you really mean "thank you." And then it illustrated a bunch of examples. So it was a person rushing into a diner and says, "I'm so sorry I'm late." And the corollary to it was, "Thank you so much for waiting for me."
Yeah.
Or, "I'm sorry I'm such a mess," being like emotional. Instead, you could say, "Thank you for listening to me." I've started doing that, and it has cut down the number of sorries that I say in a day by a lot.
That helps, doesn't it?
Yes, and it has the added benefit of expressing gratitude to whoever the person you're in relationship with.
God calls it a bid for connection. I love that. A bid for connection, which is related to what we're talking about, a bid for relationships.
Yes, yes. So expressing your needs, just directly, because I think we do this passive aggressively a lot.
Specific, direct, and behavioral.
Yes, or your requests.
Yeah.
I just finished up finals, and so in writing all these papers, one of my friends, the friend I had mentioned earlier, I said to him last night, "Hey, can we FaceTime later tonight and read our papers to each other?" Because my brain is not functioning anymore, and I can't even pay attention to my own paper unless I read it out loud to someone. Can you be that someone? And he responds back and he's like, "Ha!" It's like, "Actually, I'm really behind in my paper and I don't think I'm going to be able to tonight." And I said, "Okay." You know, like, well, that's disappointing because this would have helped me, but all right, I made my request, which is vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Typically what is vulnerable is the right path.
Absolutely.
Or you can rephrase it to think, what is brave? And that's also vulnerable. So presenting your requests in a way that you can be rejected, that's how you know you're not being manipulative. If you present your requests in a way that the other person can say no, that's how you know you're not being abusive or manipulative or passive aggressive. And it also builds trust in your relationships when somebody can say no to you. And it works in the reverse. If you're in a relationship where you can't say no to that person, time to start thinking about that.
I was just thinking about how thankful I am that God has created us relational people. That's just the way He could have created us any way He wanted to, but that's just the way that we are created. It's in our DNA to be relational.
Yeah. Amen. Thank God.
Oh, isn't it great? I mean,
yeah.
And I think the COVID-19, the thing that's so hard is the cutoff and not being able to be physically present and being able to touch and pat on the back and pass the peace, etc. I think it really challenges us at our very core need of relationship.
Yeah, I think so too. You know, we're in that car ride wondering when it's going to be over.
Great. That's a great image. I love that image.
Yeah. And, you know, the the answer is we don't know.
No.
We're not driving the car. We don't have the map. But what
We're
I
on the
do
journey.
know, yeah,
And thankfully, thank God, we're not alone on the journey.
yes, that's what I would say is I don't know where we're going. I don't know how it's going to last, but I do know that God is with us.
Amen.
And that he's not waiting for us to grow up and shape up. And if you have a hard time believing that, that's okay. We're very much trained to not believe that. We're trained to believe that God is as demanding and unforgiving as our parents were when we were children. So it takes effort and hopefully therapy to overcome that. But if you're sitting there thinking like, that's not true, the invitation I would give you is just start wondering with what if. Like, okay, well, yeah, God is a taskmaster is what I truly believe. But what if? What if he was patient the way that Paula, my therapist, is with me? What would my life be like if God was like kind the way that my sister is? And what would that be like? I think that's a great way to kind of bypass your own biases when it comes to what you think about God or what you think about the world. Like, all right, you don't have to believe that. Just wonder.
Be curious.
Yeah. What if God was good? What would that be like?
Well, what a concept.
Yeah. What a concept.
Oh, that's good, Amy.
I think that's all I have.
Okay, that's all I have. I've really enjoyed these weeks with you guys. I miss being in your presence, but this is second best.
Yeah.
I would like some feedback. We really don't, the value of being in person, we get to see visually and hear audibly the feedback. So if you would, I would just like to know that you've listened and you participated with us.
Now, you see, Doyle is creating a story in his head. Facts are no one is saying anything, which means that it must be bad.
That's right. That's a good point. That's a good
So
point.
if you could just help us fact check Doyle's story by letting us know what your thoughts are, what your reactions have been.
Or other studies that you would like. We'd be
Yes, that would be great. What do you want to hear more about?
So, Amy, did you have anything else to say before I pray?
I believe that's it.
Okay.
Love yourself because that's how you will love others.
Exactly. Let's pray together. Oh God of grace and God of patience, we are grateful to you for all that you are about that we know, as well as all that you are about that is hidden and unknown to us. For your mystery, we give you thanks. I thank you for each person who has heard our voices, and I pray, oh God, that they could hear your voice through our voice. That your voice of grace, of patience, of long suffering, of compassion would be heard through and through. We thank you, oh God, for the reminder that you created us as relational people. And we thank you that your love for each one of us is certainly not dependent upon who we are or what we do or what we can accomplish, but it is all dependent upon the very core of who you are. Mm-hmm. So I'm grateful to this day for your very breath, the very spirit that can give voice when we have no voice and can give expressions when we don't even know what we're thinking or feeling or experiencing. We thank you that you know us that well and so thoroughly. So thank you for the love of God and the peace of Christ. And I pray for the needs of people that have listened to us that are dealing with depression or anxiety or addiction or relationship heartaches and heartbreaks. I pray that they would be open to you in a new and fresh way as they seek to live out their lives in faith. We give you thanks this day, and we thank you for our time together. For Christ's sake, we pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. We've enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye.